One low, cramped room, 40 to 50 children sat on wooden benches, the youngest just 6 years old, the oldest 14, hand-rolling snuff for 12-hour shifts in air thick with tobacco dust. Within 2 weeks, every child developed a permanent hacking cough, some coughed blood. A child who fell asleep at the bench was beaten with a wooden stick. A 6-year-old earned half a skilling per shift, a quarter of what Karen made. And here is the number that should genuinely stop you. Most children who worked in a Copenhagen tobacco factory during this period did not live to see 30, not 30 years into the job, but 30 years old, period. Yet even this wasn't the hardest work in the city. That was down at the harbor, at the Gamel's Strand fish market. The women there were called fishwives, mostly widows, sometimes girls as young as 12 whose own mothers had died on that same wharf a decade earlier. They gutted between 1 and 2,000 herring per 10-hour shift, hands submerged the entire time in freezing salt water and fish blood. In January, the water froze the instant it touched the wooden table. Pay was 1 skilling per barrel of gutted fish. In winter, the worst part was the hands themselves. Fingers froze while they worked, and some women lost fingertips to gangrene. Some lost whole fingers, and kept working anyway. Even these women weren't the poorest people on that wharf. That title belonged to the sailors, sent on Danish ships to the colony of Tranquebar in southern India. The round trip took 18 months, and roughly half the sailors who left never came back. Wages were only paid once a voyage ended, and if a sailor died at sea, his family in Copenhagen received nothing at all. Which is exactly why, by 1728, more than half the marriages in Copenhagen's poorest quarters were between women whose first husbands had already died at sea and men who probably wouldn't come back either. Joy in this world existed in exactly 3 places. The first was the tavern, where a laundress like Karen might afford 1 evening a month of real, strong beer instead of the weak kind, singing, gossiping about the king, falling in love, occasionally fighting. An evening there cost roughly half a day's wage. The second was church, mandatory under Danish Lutheran law, with missing 3 Sundays in a row a punishable offense. But the poor genuinely loved it, because communion was often the 1 day a week a laundress ate white bread at all. The third was the Lilgernegget Theatre, which had opened just 6 years before the fire, staging satirical comedies by the playwright Ludvig Holberg that mocked the aristocracy. A standing ticket cost 1 skilling, half a day's wage for the chance to watch the rich publicly ridiculed in Danish. But behind all of Copenhagen's wealth stretched a shadow reaching all the way to West Africa. Denmark owned colonies, a fact most people, even in Denmark, still don't know today. In 1671, the Danish West India Company was chartered in Copenhagen, headquartered less than a mile from Karen's rented room. The company owned the Caribbean islands, Sti, Thomas and Sti, John, and a fortress on Africa's Gold Coast called Christiansborg, which today serves as the presidential palace of Ghana. The trade ran as a triangle. Danish ships carried muskets, iron bars, textiles, and Danish beer out of Copenhagen, traded them in Africa for enslaved men, women, and children, carried the survivors across to the Danish Caribbean, and sold them there. Roughly 100,000 Africans were transported on Danish ships over the course of this trade, and some were kept back in Copenhagen itself. Wealthy merchants, including the very ones Karen worked for, legally owned enslaved Africans as personal household servants. At the top of this entire system sat King Frederik IV, 57 years old, absolute monarch of Denmark, Norway, Iceland, Greenland, the Faroe Islands, the Danish Caribbean, and colonies in Ghana and India. 16 years earlier, he had married. October 1728, a candle tips over onto a straw mattress in one of Copenhagen's slums, and in less than 3 days, a city that had stood in that same spot for centuries simply ceases to exist. 15,000 people lose their homes in a single night. 35,000 books and 300 medieval manuscripts turn to ash, including every single surviving original manuscript by the great Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe. But the most brutal part of this story isn't what burned. It is who was allowed to come back afterward. The canals of Nyhavn, the Baroque fides, the postcard streets, every tourist photographs in Copenhagen today were built directly on top of that ash. And they weren't built for the people who lost everything that night. One of those people was a 22-year-old woman named Karen Sorensen. Picture Vesterkvarter, the Western Quarter, hours before the fire. If you'd walked through it on any October morning, the first thing that would have hit you was the smell. Contemporary physicians openly called the air in this district the worst in all of Copenhagen. 20,000 people were packed into an area roughly a third of a square mile, a population density 3 times higher than modern Manhattan. The streets were barely a meter wide, narrow enough to shake hands with your neighbor across the way just by leaning out your own window. There was no sewer system whatsoever. Waste was simply thrown into the middle of the street, into a shallow gutter that only carried it toward the harbor when it rained. When it didn't rain, it just sat there. Pigs were technically banned inside city limits, but nearly every courtyard kept one anyway, alongside chickens and ducks. Water came from public wells, one well for roughly every 200 families, and nobody actually drank it. They drank small beer instead, a weak brew that fermentation made genuinely safer than the well water. The average adult drank about 5 liters of it a day, women and children over roughly 7 years old included. The buildings themselves were four-story wooden structures with straw roofs, each floor housing a separate family in 1 or 2 rooms, all supposedly heated by a single ground floor hearth that almost never actually warmed all 4 levels at once. At 4 in the morning, Karen Sorensen is already awake. She shares a single room with no fireplace with 2 other women, a widowed weaver and a fishwife. There is no breakfast, just 3 swallows of small beer from a wooden jug and the same wool dress she wore yesterday, because she doesn't own another one. By 4:30 she is walking 12 blocks to a merchant's house on Sturgate, where she works as a laundress. By 5 she is lighting a fire beneath a copper cauldron in the courtyard, starting a 14-hour shift. The work itself: lye soap made from ash and animal fat, caustic enough to strip skin, hours of beating wet linen against a wooden board with a wooden bat, wringing everything by hand, and, as the final whitening step, stale human urine, which Karen collected nightly from her employer's chamber pots because ammonia bleached linen better than anything else available in the 18th century. By the end of a single week, her hands were cracked and bleeding, permanently smelling of urine, and in cold weather she couldn't feel her fingertips at all. And here is what should genuinely surprise you: Karen was one of the lucky ones. Laundresses were among the highest earning poor women in Copenhagen. She made 2 skilling a day, just enough for bread, herring, beer, and her share of the rent, nothing more. Most other working women earned half that. Every evening on her walk home, Karen passed a tobacco factory on Lille Canicaster D, where conditions were even worse than her own. By 1728, Copenhagen had dozens of these factories. Tobacco was one of the city's biggest industries, with ships arriving weekly from Danish Caribbean colonies loaded with dried tobacco leaf. The workers were almost entirely women and children. Inside, his 19-year-old mistress, while his queen was still alive, keeping the 2 women in separate palaces so they would never meet. He texted wigs, he texted chimneys, he texted coffee, and here is the number that says everything. The king's annual coffee bill alone, just the coffee, was worth roughly the yearly wages of 900 Copenhagen laundresses. In 29 years on the throne, he had never once set foot in Vesterkvarter, the district where 1/5 of his subjects lived. On the evening of October 20th, 1728, the King's world and Karen's world collided in the worst possible way. At 7 o'clock, in the room next door where a tobacco worker's 3 children slept, a candle fell onto their straw mattress. The straw caught almost instantly, and the screaming started immediately. The fire brigade arrived from St. Nicholas Church at 7:20, carrying leather buckets, half of them full of holes, and a hand pump that simply didn't work. By 7:30, a westerly wind picked up, gusting to roughly 40 kilometers an hour, carrying burning embers 3 blocks ahead within minutes, igniting straw roof after straw roof. Karen escaped her burning building at 8 o'clock, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and a small locked box her mother had given her before she left for Copenhagen. Everything else burned behind her. By 10, she watched her building collapse. By midnight, she stood among roughly 4,000 homeless people, watching the western sky glow orange, and the fire was only 3 hours old, with the wind already carrying embers east, toward the merchant houses on Sturgate, toward Trinitatis Church and the university library inside it, toward the aristocratic mansions on Bradgate. The fire had started among the poor, but it was coming for everyone. By Saturday morning, October 23rd, the fire had burned itself out. The toll: 1,670 buildings destroyed, 47% of Copenhagen gone, 15,000 people homeless, 35,000 books and 300 medieval manuscripts lost with the university library, including every one of Tycho Brahe's original manuscripts. Only 5 people died, and historians universally call that a miracle. But what came next wasn't a miracle, it was policy. Within weeks, Frederick IV ordered a new rebuilding plan: brick walls only, tile roofs only, wider streets, mandatory chimney inspections. On paper, it sounded like progress. In practice, brick construction cost 3 times as much as wood, and families who had just lost everything had no money to rebuild in brick, or to rebuild at all. So aristocrats and wealthy merchants bought up the burned lots of Vesterkvarter at fire sale prices and built fashionable Baroque townhouses on top of the old tenements. Karen never went back to Vesterkvarter. Neither did most of the 4,000 people who stood in those streets that first night. They were pushed out beyond the old city walls into what are now the working-class districts of Copenhagen. And Rabro, Vesterbro, Christianshavn, neighborhoods built by exactly the people the 1728 rebuild had pushed out of the center. The core truth of this story is simple. The Copenhagen you can visit today is not the Copenhagen that burned in 1728. The Baroque squares, the picturesque streets, the postcard images of the Danish capital were all built in the decades after this fire, and not by the people it destroyed. Karen didn't die on October 20th, 1728. Neither did the tobacco worker-ass family, the fishwives of Gemmelstrand, the sailors' widows, or the children of the tobacco factories. They simply lost the city that had ground them down in the first place, and no one ever gave them another one.